Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about slow motion and specifically how to create smooth slow motion in your editing software. Now, slow motion obviously starts with how you shoot. So you create slow motion by shooting at a higher frame rate, so like 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, and then converting that in post to 24 frames per second, which is what I'm going to show you how to do now. Now, there are some cameras out there like cinema cameras, Red, and other cameras that will actually do the conversion for you in camera. So when you shoot at a higher frame rate, then when you play back the video in camera, it comes out already in slow motion. So it does that conversion for you. But most of you are probably shooting on DSLRs or other mirrorless or consumer cameras, and those cameras are not going to do that for you. So when you shoot a clip in 60 frames per second and then you bring it into your editing software, it's going to show in 60 frames per second, and you're going to need to convert it to 24. So let's go into Premiere and I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about. Before you get into creating slow motion in post, the first thing you need to understand is that there's a difference between the two different types of frame rates. One is their project frame rate, and the other is your shooting frame rate. So if you look up here, I've got a timeline and a couple of clips here. I've got a timeline here called slow motion, which is the timeline that we're going to be working on. And this timeline is in 23.976 frames per second. That's 24 frames per second. So this is a project frame rate. The frame rate of the project, the actual timeline, the sequence is going to be your project frame rate. And then I've got two clips here that we're going to be working with. One of them is 23.976, so 24 frames per second, and then one of them is 59.94, so 60 frames per second. Okay, this is your shooting frame rate. All right, and slow motion is created when you have a higher shooting frame rate than your project frame rate. So when you take a higher shooting frame rate, like 60 frames per second, and you convert it to 24 frames per second, what happens is that footage at 60 frames per second expands and the frames actually stretch out in order to fit into the 24 frames per second timeline. So because the frames have to stretch out in order to slow down the footage, that's the reason why you can't just slow down a 24 frames per second clip. So for example, if I take our 24 frames per second clip here and throw it into the timeline, and this is now in a 24 frames per second timeline. So we've got a 24 frames per second clip in a 24 frames per second timeline. Everything's going to look great. Everything's going to be smooth. No problems. Now, what a lot of filmmakers will try and do is take a clip. Let me just grab a piece of this. Take a clip like this and just slow it down. Well, what happens is if you go to your speed settings here, and let's say we put the speed down to 40%, then what's going to happen is we're going to get a really stuttered look because there aren't enough extra frames in there to fill in the space. So the frames have to be stretched out and then you end up with this stuttered look. So that's the reason why you can't just turn down the speed on a clip, because you're going to end up with that effect. If you want to get smooth slow motion, you have to do the conversion from a higher frame rate. So let's do an example here with our high frame rate footage. I'm just going to find a piece of this. Let's go right here as he's walking along, putting his hand through his hair. Super cool. And then we're going to bring that in. Now, it's not going to match the sequence settings because it's obviously in 60 frames per second, but we're going to keep that. Now, when you put a 60 frames per second clip in a 24 frames per second timeline, the clip is going to play back at 24 frames per second. So as you can see, it doesn't look like it's in 60 frames per second. It doesn't slow down automatically. It's playing back in 24. You're seeing it in 24 frames per second. But because the conversion from 24 to 60 is exactly 2.5, and you can't have half frames on your timeline, what it's doing is actually kind of shoving it into that 24 frames per second timeline, and it's going to be dropping frames every once in a while. Okay, because you can't have half frames. And so as you watch through this, it takes kind of a keen eye to see it, but you'll notice that there's little jumps and little stutters in the footage based on that. So if you are shooting high frame rate footage, you only want to do that when you intend to slow it down, not all the time. Okay, so what you can do now that you've got your 60 frames per second footage in here, there's a couple ways that you can change the speed of it. First of all, you can go into your speed menu and you can just change the speed of it right here. So I could put this at 40%. Since 60 frames per second is 59.94 and 24 frames per second is 23.976. So if we do a little calculation here, 59.94 divided by 23.976. That is exactly 2.5, so exactly 40%. I can change this to 40%, and then you'll notice that the clip gets a little bit longer because it's slowing down, and we'll get really nice, smooth slow motion. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. However, this works because the calculation is really easy. It's exactly 2.5. And most of your standard frame rates are going to end up being like at least pretty close to that. But if you want to get perfect conversions every single time, like for example, if you're shooting in a really different frame rate, let's say it's 73.94 frames per second is what you chose, because some cameras will allow you to do that, then there's actually an easier way to do it inside of Premiere so that you don't have to go through this process every single time and figure out the exact conversion rate. So what I'm going to do, and this is how I normally do it, is I go into my clip here. So I've got my 59.94 clip here. I'm going to right click on it, go to modify and interpret footage. And then I'm just going to choose that I want it to assume this frame rate, 23.976. So what that's going to do is going to take my 60 frames per second clip and convert it to 23.98. In this case, it just rounds up. So now when I click OK, you'll notice that the clip now shows that it is 23.976 frames per second. So I can take that clip and find the same piece that I wanted to use, which was right here. Select it, and you'll notice that the clip is already slowed down. So if I take that and drag it into my timeline, I now have a slow motion clip that is nice and smooth, and the conversion is perfect because Premiere did it for me. So this way you can just select all of your clips that you shot in higher frame rates at the beginning of your project, select all of them, change them all to the right frame rate, and then you don't have to go through and change them individually on your timeline later. So this does work a little bit differently in other software. In Final Cut, you just select the clip in the timeline and go to the Retime menu and click on Automatic Speed, which will do the conversion for you automatically. And then in Resolve, you just right-click on the clip, select Clip Attributes, and change frame rate to 24 frames per second. So there you go. There's how to create smooth slow motion in post. I highly recommend following these methods in order to do it, because you want to make sure that you get really nice smooth slow motion. You're not getting any jittery or dropped frames in your footage. But if you do it this way and take your high frame rate footage and convert it to 24 like I showed you, then you'll get a really smooth look in post.